I was alone in the store after closing, the lights off out front and just the one bulb on over the counter, when I played the voicemail for the 4th time. It was from a man at the bank, a polite young fellow, and he said, "Hi, Faye, returning your call about the second account on the business, the one your manager set up. Everything looks in order on our end, but call me back if you've got questions." The second account, the one my manager set up. I stood there at the counter where I'd rung up 40 years of nails, paint, garden hose and small talk, and I felt the floor of my whole life go soft. Because I had not called the bank, and I did not have a second account. And the only manager I had was a man I'd hired when he was a skinny 17-year-old and raised up over 25 years, like the son I never got to keep. I want to tell you what I did about it, because it would have been easier to do almost anything else. It would have been easier to believe it was a mistake. It would have been easier, at 70 years old, to be tired and let it go. What I did instead was cold and clean, and it cost me a piece of my heart I am not going to get back. And I would do every bit of it again. This is the story of the longest con I never saw coming, run by the last person on earth I would have suspected, and of what an old woman does when she finally stops being too soft to look. My name is Faye Hollister. I am 70 years old, and I own Hollister Hardware on Main Street in a small town in Montana. Under a sky so big it makes you religious, ringed by mountains that were old before there were people to name them. My husband Bud and I took over that store in 1979, and we made it the beating heart of this town. The place a rancher comes at 6 in the morning for the part that'll save his whole day. The place a young couple comes for the paint for their first nursery. Bud died of a bad heart 11 years ago, right there in the stockroom. And I kept the store open alone because it was the last thing his hands had touched, and because this town would be a poorer place without somebody to sell it a single carriage bolt and mean it. You have to understand what a hardware store is to a town like mine. It is not a business so much as a public trust. When the Peterson boy, 2 ranches over, lost his arm in the baler, it was our parking lot the volunteer fire truck staged in. When the river took the bridge in the spring of 2011, half the town rebuilt it out of lumber I sold them at cost and never said a word about. I have extended credit to families through 3 bad winters on nothing but a handshake and a look in a man's eye. And I have almost never been wrong about the look, which is the bitter joke at the center of this whole story. I could read every rancher and every young couple and every traveling stranger who ever walked through my door. The one face in 40 years I read wrong was the one I'd have bet my life on. Let me set one thing down plain and not pick at it again, because it is the nail the whole thing hangs on. There is a difference between a person you love and a person you can trust with the keys, and they are not always the same person. And the day you forget there's a difference is the day the smartest thief in your life walks right past your heart and into your safe. I forgot it for 25 years. I am telling you so you won't. Hold on to that. Now let me tell you about Shane, because to understand how deep this cut, you have to understand how much I loved him. Shane Peterson came to me looking for work at 17. A hard, watchful kid from a hard family, the kind of boy this town had already written off. Bud was still alive then, and he saw something in him, and we hired him to sweep up and stock shelves. And over the years, that boy became the best hardware man in 3 counties. He could find anybody, anything. He knew where every washer and every wood screw lived in that store. knew it in his hands the way I do. After Bud died, Shane was the one who kept me standing. He came in early and stayed late. He carried the heavy things my back couldn't anymore. He learned the books, the ordering, the vendors, all the parts of the business Bud used to carry. And he carried them. And I was grateful down to my shoes. I taught that boy to mix paint and cut glass and rethread a pipe. And he taught the next young hire. And that is how a trade and a store stay alive, hand to hand. And I thought I was watching mine get handed safely to the future. I loved him. I am not ashamed to say it even now. I went to his wedding, and I held his babies in the hospital, and I kept their school pictures taped to my register next to where Bud's used to be. I'll give you one memory, because it's the one that still catches me wrong in the ribs. The winter after Bud died, I couldn't make myself open the store some mornings. Just couldn't turn the key. And more than once I'd get there at 6 and find Shane already inside. Lights on, coffee made, the wood stove going, the open sign already flipped. And he'd just say, "Mornin', Faye." Like he hadn't done a thing. Like he hadn't quietly kept my husband's store alive on the days I couldn't. I thought that was love. Maybe some little corner of it was. But a man can keep your wood stove going with one hand and pick your lock with the other. And the hell of it is that both hands belong to the same person. And you don't get to keep only the warm one. I handed him the keys to the store without a second thought. Gave him the safe combination. Let him run the deposits. Because by then, he wasn't an employee. He was the son Bud and I were never given. And I had put it in my will. And I'd sat him down and told him so. Looked him square in his eyes and told him that when I was done, Hollister Hardware was his. Every nail of it. Because there was no one else on this earth I trusted to keep it what Bud and I had made it. I was going to hand that man my entire life's work and call it the best decision I ever made. You need to know all of that, the whole height of it, because it is the only way to measure how far the fall went. If you have ever loved someone you worked beside for years, someone who became more like family than your family ever managed to be, then you already know that handing over the keys to a business is a kind of love letter. And you know how much it would take to admit that the love letter had been steamed open by a thief. It is a particular grief, being robbed by someone you'd have vouched for with your life. It shames you twice, once for the loss and once for the loving. If you've stood in that exact spot, betrayed by your own good judgment about a person, I would truly be glad to know where you're listening from tonight, and I hope you'll stay, because the part that matters most is how it ends. But let me get back to it, because that voicemail was only the first loose thread. And the moment I pulled it, the whole bright story I'd been telling myself for 9 years came apart in my hands. It started, before the voicemail even, with an old rancher named Cyrus Webb, who came in red-faced one afternoon, asking where in the world the special order log splitter was that he'd put $400 down on back in the spring. I didn't know a thing about it. There was no order in the book, no log splitter on its way, and no $400 I could account for. I apologized, and I made it right out of the register, and I told myself it was a mix-up, that Shane had simply forgotten to write it down. Because that is what a heart does when it loves somebody. It reaches for the kindest explanation and grabs on tight. But it sat wrong with me through supper and into the night. Cyrus Webb is 81 years old and sharp as a barbed wire fence. And he is not a man who imagines $400 or forgets he paid it. And then a few days later, there was another one. A young woman who'd put a deposit on a custom storm door that never came. and she didn't make a fuss. She just asked timidly if maybe there'd been a delay. And I covered that one too, out of the register, with a smile, while something cold turned over in my stomach. And then came the voicemail from the bank about the second account I never opened. And 40 years of reading this town, of knowing when a man at my counter was lying about why he needed the money, rose up in me all at once and started ringing like the fire bell on the wall. So I did what I should have done the very first day, and I am ashamed it took me so long. Ashamed it took a voicemail and an angry rancher to make me look at my own books in my own store. I waited until Shane left for the weekend, told him to go on home to his family, that I'd close up, and I locked the front door and pulled the shades and sat down at the desk in the back with everything. The real books and the bank statements and the special order log and the vendor file. And I stopped being his second mother and started being the owner of a business that was quietly bleeding to death. I made a pot of coffee and I did not go home. I went through it the way Bud taught me to go through a hard inventory. Slow, one shelf at a time, no skipping, and the further in I got, the colder and steadier my hands became. The way they do when a thing you've been dreading turns out to be real and there's nothing left to do but face it square. By midnight, I wasn't crying anymore. By midnight, I was counting. It was everywhere, once I knew how to see it. There was the second account, where customer deposits for special orders had been quietly routed for years. Deposits on splitters, doors, generators that never got ordered. The customers refunded out of my register when they complained loudly enough, and simply robbed when they didn't. There were vendor invoices that didn't match anything we'd ever received, paid out to suppliers I'd never heard of, suppliers with post office box addresses that I would come to learn were just Shane, paying himself with my money for parts that never existed. There was payroll, padded with overtime he never worked. There was cash skimmed off the daily deposit, a little at a time, the oldest trick there is. A few bills here and there that over 9 years had become a river. I sat at that back desk until 2 a.m, with a calculator in one hand and Bud's old green ledger open under the lamp. And I added up what the son of my heart had taken from me. And it came to more than $70,000. And it had been running, near as I could trace it, for the better part of 9 years. 9 years. I made myself say the number out loud in the empty store. I thought about all the times in those 9 years he'd hugged me, the times he'd brought me soup when I had the flu, the way he'd stood beside me at Bud's memorial with his hand on my shoulder, while his other hand, I now understood, had already been in the till for a year. The arithmetic of it was bad. The arithmetic of the love was worse. And then I found the worst of it, the part that turned my grief into something harder and more useful. Because the stealing, by itself, I might almost have found a way to understand if there'd been a sickness or a true desperation under it. But Shane wasn't only bleeding the store. He was setting it up to die, so he could buy the carcass cheap. I found the file in his desk, careless, because he never dreamed I'd look. He'd been talking to a developer out of the city about the building and the corner lot it sits on. He'd been telling the bank, and I would learn soon enough half the town as well, that poor Faye was slipping, getting forgetful, losing track of things, that the store was struggling under an old woman who couldn't keep up anymore, and that the kindest thing, the merciful thing, would be for loyal Shane to take it off her hands before she ran her late husband's legacy clean into the ground. Do you see what he'd done? He'd been manufacturing the very decline he was describing. Every dollar he stole made the books look sicker, and the sicker the books looked, the more it seemed like I was failing. And the more it seemed like I was failing, the more reasonable it would look when he offered to buy me out for pennies. And everyone in town sighed with relief that dear Shane was there to catch me. He had not only been robbing me blind, he had been building a careful public case that I was too old and too addled to know it, so that my own confusion would become his cover and his alibi and his purchase price all at once. That was the thing that dried my tears. A thief takes your money. This boy had been trying to take my mind, my name, the story of my own life, and hand me back a smaller, dimmer version of myself that would sign whatever he put in front of me and thank him for it. Now I have to tell you about the lowest night, because I won't dress this up to look braver than I was. Sitting there in the dark of my own store at 2 a.m, what I felt first was not rage, it was doubt. Because he had done his work well, the public part of it, the story about my mind, and a tired 70-year-old woman who has just discovered she's been a fool for 9 years, does not feel like a fortress. She feels like exactly the confused old thing the story says she is. I sat there, and the doubt crept in like cold under a door. Maybe I had missed it because I was slipping. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe a woman my age had no business fighting a sharp man of 42 with a developer on the phone and the bank in his pocket and half the town already nodding along. Maybe the dignified thing, the restful thing, was to take his lowball offer and go quietly. Salvage what was left of my pride. Spare myself the ugliness of a fight I might lose in public. I actually took out a pen. I sat at Bud's desk, and I got as far as putting the pen to the corner of that offer he'd left me, the surrender he'd designed. And I came within an inch of signing away 40 years, because a thief had convinced me I was too old to trust my own 2 eyes. That was the lowest I have been since the morning I found Bud cold on the stockroom floor. They had nearly won. Not with the theft, with the story about my mind, which is the cruelest theft there is, because it robs you of the one tool you'd need to notice you've been robbed. What turned me was Bud's ledger. I sat there with my hand shaking over that lowball offer, the pen already touching the paper, and my eyes fell on Bud's handwriting in that old green book. 40 years of it. Every order and every account, in his careful slanted hand, and then in mine after he was gone. 2 lifetimes of honest work, written down 1 line at a time. And I heard him, as clear as if he'd walked out of the stockroom, wiping his hands on his apron. "Faye," he said, the way he used to, "you built this place with your own 2 hands and a coffee can full of dimes, and you have forgotten more about this store than that boy will ever learn. Don't you dare let a thief tell you what your own mind is worth." And something in me went very still, very cold, very clear, which is a far better thing than rage, because rage is loud and clumsy, and clear is quiet and does not miss. I set the pen down. I was not slipping. I had been trusting, which is an entirely different thing. A thing I had every right to do and no reason to be ashamed of. But I was done trusting now, at least where this was concerned. And let me tell you something I learned that night at 70 years old. A woman who is done being fooled, who has clear eyes and 40 years of records and absolutely nothing left to lose but the truth, is the most dangerous person in any room. And the thief who mistook her softness for stupidity has already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. So I stopped being soft, and I went to work. The way I'd have worked any hard job in that store, with the right tools and no shortcuts. I did 3 things. First, I called my accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Marie, who'd been after me for years to modernize, and whom I'd waved off because Shane had it handled. And I called a lawyer who'd built his whole practice on exactly this kind of quiet, ugly business. And instead of asking either of them to make my pain go away, I asked them to help me make it airtight. Every fake invoice, every dollar that had flowed into the second account, every padded paycheck and skimmed deposit, documented, dated, photographed, traced by name and by number straight back to his hand. Marie worked nights with me in the back of that store with the shades down. The 2 of us and a banker's lamp and 9 years of lies. And she taught me how to read what I'd spent a lifetime trusting somebody else to read. Here is the beautiful, terrible truth about a long con. It leaves a long trail. The very thoroughness that lets a thief steal for 9 years without tripping is the same thoroughness that hangs him when somebody finally follows the line back. Shane was so proud of his own cleverness, kept such tidy books of his own thieving, that he had, without ever once dreaming the slipping old lady would be the one to read them, written out his entire confession in advance, in his own careful hand, in records he thought were hidden. His cleverness was the rope. He had tied every knot in it himself, and all I had to do, in the end, was hold it up to the light. Second, I told no one, and I changed nothing, for 3 whole weeks. I smiled at Shane every single morning, and let him go on believing the storm door and the log splitter were forgotten old lady mix-ups. I let him keep starring in his own story about the slipping widow, because every single day he believed it was another day Marie spent quietly tracing another dollar, another fake invoice, another deposit into the secret account. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than burying Bud, because grief at least is honest. This was theatre. I poured that boy his coffee the way I had for 25 years. I asked after his wife and admired the new pictures of his kids on his phone, the kids I'd held in the hospital. And I smiled. And inside, I was a woman taking apart, bolt by bolt, the machine her own son had built to grind her up. Some mornings I'd go home and shake, but I had decided one thing for certain, sitting on that cold floor. He would not get a warning. People kept telling me later that I should have confronted him sooner, given him a chance to make it right. They didn't understand. A warning is a courtesy, and courtesy is a thing you extend to people who didn't steal from you with one arm around your shoulders at your husband's grave. And third, when it was all in a binder thick as a Bible, I ended it in one cold morning with no scene at all. I asked Shane to come in early, before we opened, and I sat him down at the same back desk where I'd done all that adding, and I slid the binder across to him without a word and watched him open it. I will tell you, I watched his face the way you'd watch a stranger's, because that is what he had turned out to be all along. A stranger, wearing a face I loved. I watched the confidence drain out of it page by page. The second account, the phantom vendors with their post office boxes, the developer letters, his own handwriting, cataloguing his own crimes in the careful hand I had taught him. And when he finally looked up, he didn't bother to deny any of it, which I almost respected. He went instead for the grievance, which I had known was coming, because there is always a grievance under these, a story the thief tells himself so he can sleep. He said I'd worked him to the bone for 25 years and never once made him a partner. He said he'd built this store as much as I had, that he'd carried me after Bud died and never been thanked in anything but words, that he deserved it, that he was only ever taking what should have been his by rights. His voice got loud and wet, thick with self-pity, and I let him empty all of it out onto that desk, every drop. And I felt the last of my heartbreak harden into something I could stand on. Because there it was, the whole rotten root of it. A grown man who had decided that being loved like a son entitled him to rob his mother, and who'd mistaken my trust for my weakness, which is the exact mistake that was about to cost him everything. I let him finish, and then I said the only thing I had planned to say, in a voice I kept low and even on purpose, because I had learned by then that quiet cuts deeper than loud. I said, "Shane, look at me. I was going to give you this store. It is written in my will, in black ink, and I told you so to your face. All you ever had to do was be patient and be honest, and the whole thing would have been yours, free and clear, the day I laid down. You didn't steal what should have been yours. It was already going to be yours. What you stole was the only thing I had left in this world worth more than the store, which was my trust in you. And that, son, you cannot carry back in here and put on a shelf." And then I told him how it was going to be, and I never once raised my voice. He would sign a confession of judgment and a repayment agreement that Marie and the lawyer had drawn up tight as a drum, with a lien on his truck and his house. And he would pay back every stolen dollar over however many years it took. Or he could explain all of it to 12 strangers in a courtroom instead. His choice. He would never set foot in Hollister Hardware again. And I would be making certain, quietly and completely, that every business owner in this valley knew exactly who Shane Peterson was and exactly what he did, so that he could never again walk into some other trusting soul's life and do to them what he'd done to me. That last part, I told him plainly, was not revenge. It was a debt I owed to the next soft-hearted old fool with a good employee and an open safe. He signed. Of course he signed. A man who builds a paper trail that thorough is not a man eager to read it aloud to 12 strangers in a jury box. And then he stood up to go. And for just 1 second, the hardness cracked clean down the middle. And I saw him, the actual him. The skinny, scared 17-year-old who'd come through my door hungry a quarter century before. And his eyes filled, and he said, "I'm sorry, Faye. I really am." And the terrible thing is, I believe a sliver of him meant it, even then. But I had learned, finally, the difference between what a person feels and what a person does. And I was too old and too newly clear to confuse them ever again. So I said, "I know you are, Shane. And it doesn't change one single thing. Because sorry is a word, and that binder is a deed. And a life is built out of the deeds, not the words. You taught me that. You just didn't mean to." He went out through the store he'd meant to steal. Past 40 years of my life lined up honest on the shelves. And the bell over the door rang behind him the same bright way it had rung behind 10,000 decent customers who'd paid for what they carried out. I turned the deadbolt. And then, only then, with the blinds down and not one living soul to see, I lowered myself onto the cold plank floor of my own store. The floor Bud and I had walked smooth over 40 years. And I wept. Not for the money. The money was coming back. I wept for the son I'd thought I had, who it turned out had never quite existed, and maybe never got to exist for anybody, which is the saddest part of all. The reckoning held, because cold, clean, and lawful holds in a way that hot and loud never does. The money came back, slowly, lien by lien, payment by payment, garnished off his wages and pulled out of the equity in his house. And more of it came back than I'd dared hope, because Marie is relentless, and a confession of judgment is a hard thing to wriggle out of. The store did not die. It is, in plain fact, doing better than it has in a decade, now that there isn't a hole in the bottom of it the size of a grown man's greed. Word went around the valley the way I'd promised it would, quietly and completely. And the last I heard, Shane had to go 2 counties over to find work, because there is no business owner within 50 miles who'll hand that man a key now. Which is exactly the point, and exactly the debt I paid forward to the next trusting fool. And the town, my town, the one he'd tried to convince that I was slipping, did a thing that mended me more than the money ever could. They just kept coming. Cyrus Webb came in the week it all came out, 81 years old, and he set his hat on my counter and said, "Faye, I never believed a word of that talk about you losing your marbles. A woman who can find me the right cotter pin blindfolded in this store has got more marbles than the whole town put together." And he bought a box of screws he didn't need, which is how a Montana man says he loves you. That is the town Shane bet against. He should have known better. I did, once I remembered to. And I found, in the wreckage, a gift I hadn't earned. There was a young woman named Lacey who'd been working my register part-time while she finished up at the community college. 20 years old, quick as a whip, and honest as a Montana morning. In the hard months after, when I needed hands I could trust and didn't think I had any left, Lacey stepped up. She came in early. She learned the ordering. She asked good questions and owned her mistakes, and never once flinched when I went over the numbers. So I am training her now, the right way this time, with the books open in front of her from her very first day, the deposits double-checked, the accounts reconciled out loud between us every Friday afternoon over coffee. And here is what I most want you to understand. Lacey does not mind. She has never once minded the open books or the double-checking, because honest people never do. The open book only ever frightens the one person who's been writing lies in it. That, it turns out, is the cheapest and surest burglar alarm a body can own. And it costs nothing but the humility to admit that loving someone was never the same as being sure of them. So here is what I'll leave you with, and then I'll let you go. The longest cons in this life are never run by strangers. A stranger can't get to your safe. A stranger never had the combination, never had a key cut, never sat across your Christmas table. The longest cons are run by the ones you handed the keys to, the ones you love, the ones you would have sworn on your husband's grave would sooner cut off their own hand than take $1 of yours. Because that swearing, that absolute certainty, is the very door they walk in through. So hear me, because I paid $70,000 and a piece of my heart to learn it. I am not telling you to love people less. I loved Shane Peterson for 25 years, and I will not pretend, even now, that those years were a lie, or that I regret a single one of them. I am telling you that loving a person and trusting that person with everything you own are two different acts. And you're allowed to do the first with your whole open heart, and still do the second with your eyes wide open and your books in your own two hands. Check the numbers on the sun of your heart. Keep the ledger even on the ones you'd die for. Not because love is foolish, but because love is exactly the costume a certain kind of thief puts on to get close enough to rob you. And the only protection against it is the plain, unglamorous habit of looking. The honest people in your life will never once resent you for keeping the books open. Remember that. It's the whole tale in a sentence. Only the thief is afraid of the open book. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, then I suspect you've handed somebody the keys once too. And I hope to God they were worthy of them. And if they weren't, I hope you found out while you still had time to change the locks. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And tell me, have you ever been robbed by someone you'd have sworn would never do it? I'd like to know I'm not the only one who had to learn this late. Stay on a while, and I'll tell you another. The coffee's hot, the wood stove's going, and the books, for anyone who cares to look, are open.